Hi, I'm Dan Sweeney, the Director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business here on the University of Denver campus. This is the second in a series of interviews we're doing with selected members of the Daniels College of Business faculty on topics that are of current interest in the area of enterprise ethics. The topic today is the ethics of executive compensation. On Sunday, June 17th, the New York Times published their annual report on the compensation of the 200 highest paid CEOs in the United States. The median number for these 200 executives was $14.5 million, and that's about a 5% increase from last year. The New York Times also, in the preceding April, published a report on the the CEO compensation of the 100 largest corporations in the UK, and that showed very similar levels and trends. So we've got the numbers, and now we're waiting for the pundits to come out with complaints and criticisms of money grubbing and greed, and on the other side, defenses in the manner of, well, it's just a natural result of a free enterprise system. So the Institute has been wanting to kind of shed some light on this issue. So we've invited two experts in the areas of business ethics and executive compensation to help us understand what's going on here. Don Mayer is a professor in residence in the Department of Business Ethics and Legal Studies at the Daniels College of Business. Don has extensive experience in teaching and research at the university level. He also has experience in the private sector and the military sector as a practicing attorney. Don's expertise is in the areas of business ethics, corporate social responsibility, and ethics in global capitalism. Don, thanks for joining us this morning.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
John Balkcom is a current and former independent director of a variety of private and public corporations. He is also president emeritus of St. John's College in Santa Fe. However, John spent the majority of his career as a consultant to major U.S. corporations, advising them and their boards on issues of executive compensation. John, welcome. Thanks for joining us this morning. Well, guys, I think we've got a good counterpoint here, two vantage points from which to look at this issue of ethics of executive compensation. So let's get on with it.
Sounds good.
Good.
Gentlemen, the AFL-CIO, as they do every year, came out with their review of executive compensation and the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and pegged the median number at about $13 million, about a 14% increase over the previous year. They also reported that since 1980, the ratio of the median CEO compensation to the median average worker compensation grew from 40 times to 380 times. So what's going on here? I mean, how come this has grown so much over this past 30 years?
Several things going on in my mind. Certainly, executive compensation consultants have had a lot to do with this, have played a hand in the ratcheting up in compensation over time at the request of their clients. No question that the executive recruiting game, if you will, has also had a role in that as major companies have competed for talent, and talent that is demonstrably better at creating value, especially in large corporations. And I would even speculate, and some of the academics who've studied this over the years have suggested that some CEOs, in a sense, regard themselves as being in a tournament. And this is one of the ways of gauging who's winning the tournament, what they take home. And Probably one of the underlying factors that gets less attention is that equity has gone from being, that is ownership in the company or options in the company, has gone from being a modest part of compensation in the 50s to a substantial part of compensation in the 90s and now the 2000s. So all of those together have helped to inflate executive compensation and get to a ratio that's 380 to 1 against workers' compensation.
Yeah. Don, what do you think?
Well, I like John's tournament idea. From what I've read, there is a competition going on, and of course the CEOs are very competitive, and they'd better be. Right? We want that. But in 1992, the SEC decided to require enhanced disclosure of these pay packages. And so once these folks could see what everybody else was getting, it became more like a competition, more like a tournament. So people judge their compensation in relative terms. If I'm making more than you are, I feel good about myself. If I'm making less than John, I want what he's got. I mean, that's just human nature. And Dan Ariely's studies have shown at MIT and at Duke that people judge their pay in relative terms, right?
So guys, well, there's one word I didn't hear in that conversation, and that's greed. I read that in all the op-eds and all the editorials and most of the reportage on these issues of executive compensation, but it didn't come up. So is it not all about greed?
My experience of these chief executives is they're pretty comfortable people in terms of their financial well-being. And I rarely hear that I want another 10 million or another 100 million. More, as I think Don said, it's more about competition. I see that you're making 20 million, I want to make 25 million. I want to win that contest in some sense. So I don't see a big element of greed in this, and in particular don't see that if we address the greed component, that's going to solve this problem.
We might address it to some extent. I think in the popular conception, an executive that gets a big bonus and takes risks and loses money for the company and still gets a big golden parachute and all kinds of other benefits, how would you take that unless you had a little bit of greed inside of you, and the public would perceive that as, well, this is a person who's taking what they don't deserve. Generally, I think it's more like these people feel competent, they feel stressed, they feel very responsible, they feel that they're entitled, and in most cases they really are, because those are tough jobs. I think it's when the public sees people taking something that is not deserved that it's the public saying greed, and I think if you are in fact greedy, you probably don't even know it.
This is an excellent point. I think the competition is not, in fact, so much that I want to make more than you do. I want my company to outperform your company. Mm-hmm. And then I want the benefits of that if I, in fact, outperform you. Yeah. That's the real competition.
That's helpful.
Action.
So John, these are very large numbers, right? But just because they're large doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, does it? Or maybe it does. I mean, why does everybody think that large compensation numbers are inherently bad?
Well, you mentioned the ratio earlier between CEO compensation and the compensation of employees. And certainly there are some extreme cases of that, many of them. And there are cases of badly timed decisions by major companies. I remember in the early 90s, General Motors changed its bonus plan, disclosed it all in the proxy statement, showed that if their bonus plan had been what they were proposing to put in, then in the previous year, when they had laid off thousands of workers, the bonuses would have been even larger. So very bad timing. Mm-hmm. And I think the negative consequence that can come from this kind of compensation is damage to management credibility within the company in the eyes of the workers. And there's a lot of evidence, as I'm sure Don can tell us, that that kind of damage to management credibility impairs performance over time in companies. So there is a downside to it, especially when companies, GM in the early 90s, make badly timed decisions.
Don, what do you think?
Well, just looking at harmful effects on the company, there are some writers, and it makes sense that when someone gets big compensation, and those ratios are very, very large, who is paying that extra compensation? When you get cases where middle management is squeezed or salary workers are squeezed, and to make room for the new champion, the new leader, does that affect morale? Some people think it does, and it affects morale adversely. You also have examples where performance and pay are not well aligned, and the company does in fact suffer, and yet the CEO does not. Again, that element of fairness creeps in there, and that affects morale as well. In mergers and acquisitions, say Kraft Cadbury in 2009, Irene Rosenfeld got a 40% increase in her compensation. Now, one of her achievements was the hostile takeover of Cadbury. Did I get that right? Kraft. She's the CEO of Kraft. And they took over Cadbury. A lot of people in Cadbury were squeezed in that merger. And of course, corporate cultures coming together is one of the most difficult things in a merger. So if you reward that behavior and you say, you done good, and we're giving you a 40% increase in your compensation, and meanwhile, people in the acquired company are suffering and the cultures don't merge as well, it isn't necessarily the best for the company. So just focusing on rewarding the executive without looking at the entire company can be really detrimental in many cases.
I also suspect that there are effects on society more broadly. If you compare the U.S., for example, to New Zealand, the relative levels of pay between the top of the house and the shop floor, if you will, differ quite substantially between the U.S. and New Zealand. Your 380 gives an indication of just how steep that line is in the U.S. And if you look at similar kinds of numbers in New Zealand and Australia, it's a much flatter line. And that suggests to me a set of values that says, yes, CEO job is maybe bigger and more complex, but that doesn't mean it's worth 380 times as much. So I think in some ways that line represents a value system that we hold, that winners take the prize. Maybe the tournament thing we talked about before.
But the practical effect of having that gross disproportion means that economically and societally, the people with the spending power have less at their disposal. And usually you hear, and I've heard this for years, the economy in the United States is driven 70-75% by consumer spending. So you cut consumer spending and leave the money at the top, there's only so many things that people at the top can buy. So studies have shown repeatedly that a solid middle class with purchasing power creates demand, and that the demand in turn creates jobs, which is what we're looking for right now in this economy. Now, I don't know about New Zealand, but we're suffering somewhat here. So to the extent that the public sees, this high level of executive pay and other people being squeezed, it's a bad signal in terms of its impact on the economy and society generally.
Good. So Don, when we look at something like executive compensation through an ethical lens, what new dimensions should come into focus? What kinds of ethical principles or standards should we apply to help us understand this issue?
Great question, Dan. Ethical lens, actually, there's quite a few different perspectives or lenses that you can take a look at executive compensation. Social contract comes to mind, and social contract is the idea that within society the corporation has some responsibilities in exchange for, say, limited liability, perpetual duration, that the corporation gives jobs, products and services that we need, pays taxes, kind of notion of corporate citizenship there. So to the extent that we have a good society, often, at least throughout the 20th century, we believed it was because we had good corporations producing good things and services and providing jobs and paying taxes. There has been, over the last 30 years, a tendency for corporations to outsource the jobs, to lay people off, to squeeze the pay of middle level or lower level employees, and to avoid taxes. Apple's an example where they're paying almost no California taxes because through lawyering and accounting, they've managed to situate themselves at least partly in Nevada, so they don't have to pay the 8.5% to California. And yet they're very proud of their California, made in Cupertino. So there's a disconnect there between the benefits going to society and the benefits to the corporation. And insofar as this is a social contract issue, we'd say that the corporation is not living up to its part of the deal. But this is much discussed publicly. There's an interesting perspective as well from utilitarianism. And many companies get this wrong. They believe that if they're doing the best for the company, they're automatically doing the best for society. This isn't necessarily true. The best for Ford Motor Company may or may not be the greatest good for society. We saw in the Ford Pinto case, we have to make this 2,000 pound, no more than $2,000 Ford Pinto. And when you say this is what we're going to do and this is what we're going to make, you can easily overlook the sense of the good for the entire society. So again, utilitarianism is about the greatest good for society, not just the company. So we may hire an executive to create value for the company, but we're not necessarily creating value for the greater society. In terms of virtue ethics, some things came up this morning. I think we were talking about this earlier, Dan. When you look at Jamie Dimon and the recent loss of $2 billion from trading done by the Whale in London, or is it $5 billion? Or I think I saw a figure this morning, maybe $9 billion. Jamie Dimon, I believe, has said that he will not take as big a bonus or any bonus. And if he hasn't said that, he probably should from the perspective of virtue ethics. The virtuous CEO would not take a job at such a high rate of pay that he would or she would disrupt the corporate culture and the sense of trust and belongingness in a certain organization. They would say, no, I don't want that. I want us to be together. I want the ratios to be more fair. I want everybody to think that we're all on board. I don't want to be that much above everybody else. I'm in this for the good of the company. That would be very virtuous. So that when Dimon says, I can't take a bonus under these circumstances, I'm responsible, and I'm going to take responsibility. I'm not just going to say I'm responsible. I'm going to give back to the company because I have hurt the company by failing to supervise the Whale in London. We could also talk about deontology as another lens. What universal rule would apply for executive compensation? You might say something like, an executive should be compensated in proportion to the benefit that he or she creates for the company, but also in terms of any kind of clawback or punishment or take back by the corporation from the compensation, that the executive should also be punished or corrected to the extent of the harm that they do. So we'll talk about clawbacks later, but there's a lot of different perspectives that bear on this issue, and it's no surprise that it gets a lot of press.
Speaking of press, what about the Milton Friedman argument from the early 70s that the role of the CEO is to deliver profit to the shareholders, and only that?
We always use that reading in our very first course in Daniels College of Business, and we always grapple with that, and we bring in John Mackey and other perspectives to give a larger framework for all of this. I would say in terms of utility and utilitarianism, first of all, he is just talking about the good of the company. He makes no pretense to be talking that the corporation should be creating good for society. I believe he assumes that it will, because he says that you would obey the law, you maximize profits within the law and consistent with ethical custom. So in 1970 or 71, whenever it was, corporations were paying more taxes, they were employing more people, they weren't outsourcing. He may just have assumed that corporations do good for society, particularly in the sense that they focus on their core competencies and do what they should do, as opposed to making philanthropic gifts or getting into areas where they have no competence. And that makes sense. But he's not really talking about the social contract generally, or the utility specifically towards society of maximizing shareholder value.
So, John, when the critics write about executive compensation, they eventually come around to calling it just unfair. So, how should we think about this issue of fairness when we think about executive compensation? What should fair look like?
I think of fairness from two different points of view. First off, there are a number of companies that have devised their own homegrown principles for fairness. For example, Ben & Jerry's and Whole Foods established ratios that set the maximum of the compensation of the top person in the company versus the average worker, and therefore stipulate a fairness principle that no one can make more than X times the average worker. That is one way to attack the fairness question. A second that I use is a notion of relative performance of the company. That is, how is this company performing versus its competitors, and even versus companies not in its industry in the market for publicly traded securities, for example. And generally speaking, I would say the CEO of a company that's providing exceptional shareholder returns over an extended period of time, as did Roberto Goizueta at Coca-Cola, for example, in some sense deserves much higher compensation than that of his competitors, and even, again, CEOs in other industries. So I would anchor an argument of fairness in those two ways. One, do we as a company have a principle that says here's how much we're going to pay? And two, do we perform better than other companies do? But there are many companies, I mentioned General Motors example earlier, who have made some decisions where they're clearly shifting compensation in the early 90s in favor of the top management and against the interest of the workers, demonstrated by larger bonuses to management and layoffs to the workers. I'd be hard pressed to say that that's fair in any sense. It seems to me that does damage both to the reputation of the company and to the fabric of the workforce within the company. So I think fairness comes into play in those ways. And again, third example we touched on earlier, some countries have a different value system for what the relative value of a CEO is versus others. And so I think we have attached a great value to producing big improvements in the equity value of a company, and with that, big compensation for CEOs.
So Don, if you take the issue of fairness and look at it from an ethical or from an ethics standpoint, how do you think about fairness from that point of view?
Well, aside from ratios, which we don't want the government prescribing ratios, and most ethicists would endorse any kind of self-organized or homegrown set of ratios, but that goes to the numbers. Ethicists would also say that the process is important. The process has to be not just transparent, because you can be very transparent about very complicated numbers and figures to where shareholders and anybody else don't really know what's going on. So there's some process issues around compensation committees, making sure that the compensation committee board members have no conflicts of interest, whether direct or indirect, making sure that there's good independent advice to that committee and the board generally, consulting with the shareholders, making sure that the pay incentives are aligned for long-term performance. Those kinds of things can make, even if the results don't always work, if the process is good, people are generally satisfied that they did their best.
I might just add that some of this apparent unfairness in compensation has come in response to the pundits, the analysts, the shareholder activists, and what have you, who back in the 70s did not like that management compensation was tied principally to accounting numbers. And the argument back then was, by tying them to accounting numbers, we're letting bonuses be set by something that management can manipulate. That led to a shift heavily in favor of using equity instruments to grant compensation. Well, that introduced a huge amount of variability. And if you look at the rise in the consumer price index from 1935 to 2010 of 15-fold, and the rise in the Dow Jones index from 1935 to 2010 of 80-fold, you get some notion of why it is that this addition of equity has produced very large increases in compensation. So in some sense, the shareholder activists and pundits got exactly what they're asking for. Greater tie to shareholder value. And there's been a lot of shareholder value created in the last 75 years.
Excellent. So John, there's apparently been a lot of research that suggests that money may not be as strong a motivator for senior executive performance, one, as we thought, and secondly, as it has traditionally been. Do you agree with that?
Well, let me say first off that there's little doubt in my mind that many of these chief executives are competing with their peers in other companies, but it's not just on the money. They are competing to run a successful company. They are competing to introduce a new product. They're competing to crack a market that no one's ever cracked before. They're competing to leave a legacy that's in some way distinctive. So my experience with them is that their motivations are as much intangible as tangible. It's not just the money they're going to make from having this success. They're competing, for example, in being global companies, which is a relatively new phenomenon if you think about it, and one that's pretty tough for a CEO to manage.
Don?
I think the idea of purpose and creativity is key here. I want to mention the recent work of Daniel Pink at Harvard, who looks at motivation, and we teach Daniel Pink in the human resource class. But in various experiments by economists at MIT, Carnegie Mellon, and Chicago, later by sociologists, and later by psychologists, and even beyond the United States, an experiment run in India, rural India, showed pretty much the same thing. And the key learning here is that when you've got a series of tasks, whether it's memorizing a string of digits, spatial tasks, mechanical tasks, word puzzles, if you've got something that's mechanical, the higher the pay, the better the performance. But as a model, that does not translate to the level of the C-suite, where you have huge needs for creativity, innovation, and other kinds of mental work. In fact, these experiments showed that if it's mental work, the more you reward, the less results you get. Very counterintuitive and very contrary to a standard economic model. But remember, the economists first ran this experiment, MIT, Chicago, Carnegie Mellon. So the lesson that Daniel Pink draws is that there's three things that people really want when they go to work. They want autonomy. They want to be able to create their own sense of the day and the week and what they're doing. They want to be left alone sometimes to create. They want mastery. They want to feel like they're getting better at something. So if they're going to go global, there's a process to be learned by a CEO who's going into that field. And that's exciting. That's a reward in itself. And then there's the idea of purpose, which has to be corporate-wide. So we mentioned Mackey earlier, and he came here 2 years ago and talked about the importance of purpose in the organization. If that infuses the entire organization, people are happy to go to work, regardless of their pay. Pay has to be enough that that's off the table, according to Daniel Pink. And once you get enough, whatever that is, and that's certainly debatable, then people can devote themselves to the purpose of the company, exercising autonomy, finding joy in mastery of certain kinds of tasks and accomplishments, and then you have a great corporate culture, which is more conducive to hiring someone who will be glad to work there, whether they're coming from within, preferably, or if they're coming from without, you don't have to lure them with big pay because they understand they're coming to a very special place to work.
Okay, gentlemen, so why are these numbers keep getting bigger and bigger each year?
Tough question. Certainly there's an indexing and a tracking around which an entire industry has grown up of consultants saying, here's how you ought to be compared. The biggest example that comes to mind for me is Grasso at the New York Stock Exchange. Grasso, at a time when the New York Stock Exchange was organized as a nonprofit, mind you, and the board compensation committee decided to gauge his compensation against someone who might be managing trillions of dollars in assets in an investment fund, if you will, and made what I regard as a faulty argument as to the magnitude of his job. So a part of this certainly has been the decision by consultants and board compensation committees to index compensation to peer groups that are at best faulty in their conception.
Don, any further thoughts on that?
I think that we're still living in a world where we assume most boards, most shareholders, most people that would take these jobs wrongly assume that their real reward is going to be monetary. That economics, monetary compensation drives everything. And until we get over that, we're going to see what we've been seeing.
So, John, prior to the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley, there weren't a lot of corporations who disclosed a great deal of detail or had a great deal of transparency about what they were paying executives. Nor did a lot of these corporations eagerly invite shareholder input to their decisions on executive compensation. Why have corporations been so reserved about disclosing this information?
Well, first off, I'd say that as early as 1992, corporations began to disclose more about compensation. And then, of course, with Sarbanes-Oxley and other acts, the disclosure requirements have become more specific and more comprehensive. I think the reluctance stems in part from not wanting to talk about a very complicated subject. The question of how much is the right number is a pretty hard question to answer. You know, is it 100,000, a million, 10 million? How do you say what the right number is? Hard one to answer. But more than that, in order to talk specifically about how you came to decisions about the compensation of the entire C-suite, you have to talk about a fairly complex set of performance criteria that the board and the CEO have for the company. It's generally not just earnings per share growth, generally not just return on X, generally not just even shareholder return. It's generally a set of a half a dozen indices of performance, which can be fairly complicated, and the implications of which are not straightforward. And I think the presumption on the part of the board compensation committee and the outside board members of a major company is difficult topic, not something easy to understand if it's not something you're doing frequently. And frankly, I don't want to tell my competitors exactly what I use to measure my performance. I don't want them to know what I'm indexing. Mm-hmm. Well, the disclosure rules make it imperative that companies put that information on the table. And so that's sort of opening the kimono in a way that many boards and many C-suites would rather not do.
Mm-hmm. So, Don, what's your view on this issue of detailed transparency?
I think transparency is good in theory, but perhaps not so much of a cure-all as some people might think, particularly where, as John points out, you're looking at very complicated disclosures, and unless you are very, very educated and diligent about understanding what's going on, whether you are, say, a shareholder wanting a say on pay, and whether you're an institutional investor looking for say on pay, it's difficult to understand. And so you might say no when you really mean yes. Or again, as John mentioned, this 1992, more disclosure actually meant a kind of race to the top. We usually hear the phrase race to the bottom, but if I know that so-and-so in my industry is getting, $10 million, then I want 12 million because I know that guy, and I want more. And so it began a race to the top. And so again, transparency may not be the answer to all problems. In some sense, it's good in theory, but not always in practice. Maybe the boards were wise to just leave it be.
So, gentlemen, interesting conversation. So, what can we do about this? Are there ways to kind of fix this situation if it needs to be fixed? Do we need to do something? Is it regulation? Is it clawbacks? Is it say on pay? Is it something that we can restructure the boards to do? Or are we just going to have to live with this?
I think you see that there's regulatory or governmental solutions. That's a possibility, but one which I tend to discount. My background is law. The one-size-fits-all kind of pay ratio thing doesn't seem realistic to me, given the size, variety, complexity of different businesses and industries that we have. The say on pay, we have yet to see whether that makes a difference. I have some doubts about that. I think our best hope is for better board governance, and I think John and I probably have some things to say about how that might be.
I think the best companies have addressed this by declaring what they mean by great performance, by declaring what kind of rewards they will make to their C-suite when we experience great performance, by saying what kind of ownership they want their management team to hold over a period of time so that their interests are directly aligned with the owners of the company, and by making quite transparent how they make decisions in the board compensation committee. And the best compensation committees, in my experience, just assume that everything they decide is going to be in the newspaper, and decide that they're going to speak plainly about how compensation is managed. That's sort of the best solution I see from the company side. On the regulatory side, I don't expect to see shareholders try to get control of compensation in any direct sense. You know that a relatively small percentage of the shareholders say on pay votes turned out negative. What was the percentage?
2%.
2%. And I just don't expect the shareholder to gain that kind of control. So I don't think that's a viable way to control this kind of compensation. I think board compensation committees feel in an intense way the responsibility of managing this issue for most companies. Certainly there are some extreme cases that strike me as being just out of hand, where the CEO has gained the upper hand even with his outside directors. And the cases I'm thinking of, it is men who have gained that upper hand and are winning the tournament in part by manipulating their fellow board members. I think of that as the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah. Don, you brought up the issue of board governance. You have more to say on how that might be improved to deal with this executive compensation issue?
I think John mentioned a couple of pieces there, the being transparent with the shareholders to the extent that that can help. We've talked about clawback provisions, and interesting to me that in talking to a colleague, she referred me to another colleague, University of Maryland, who actually does compensation consulting. And I talked with him briefly and mentioned clawback provisions, and he said, no, we'd never accept that. And I noticed he said we. And I gathered from that, that he's saying the good people are not going to accept the idea that they might be punished. They'd be offended by the very suggestion. I think that's a very interesting insight/comment. I'm not so sure I want someone in my organization who would be offended by the kind of proportionality I suggested before. We're going to reward you big time if you perform well. But there is a downside. It's not all, heads you win, tails I lose. So there might be an interesting approach there with clawbacks. I think that you have to also, and the Ethics Resource Center, which has been around quite a few years, has suggested, why not include ethics as one of the metrics? Now, they're not real specific as how you do this, but it occurs to me that to the extent that, and you mentioned the press, if your company is in the press for some sort of scandal, it may not rise to criminal or civil liability. There should be something in the compensation package that rewards executives who run a good culture, run a good corporate culture, and those things don't happen, that they take responsibility for that. And certainly if there are criminal fines or civil liabilities, that should they be unscathed when on their watch, these sorts of setbacks happen for the shareholders either reputationally or economically. So building in some ethics metrics to the compensation package might be a very useful thing.
I would just add that we sometimes overlook that there are market penalties to some of these things. There have been some terrific academic studies showing that if a company has to restate its earnings because they were incorrectly reported, there are significant penalties to the price of the stock of the company. And even though I don't especially care for Mr. Diamond at JP Morgan Chase, he has suffered significant consequences in the loss in the value of his stock holdings and his stock options in the company since the revelation of this, you tell me, $2, $4, or $9 billion loss that happened because of the whale in London. So there are consequences exacted by the market that often go unrecognized, and a package disclosed in the proxy statement as having been, say, $50 million may turn out to be worth substantially less because the company hasn't performed well.
Right. Okay, so we've been talking about what society or what the economy or what boards or shareholders or just people like us can do about this. And it seems to me a lot of responsibility is going to have to lay with the board of directors. And it seems to me also there may be two major decisions they could deal with to affect this. One is to have a policy of exclusively growing their own next CEO, to groom and elect a CEO. It's been with the company, and it's been inside that compensation structure for some time. And so they don't have to go outside and pay these exaggerated fees and signing bonuses and such. That's one. Secondly, they could actually take the firm private. They could go private with the company, buy out the shareholders, and not have to have these debates in the public forum. So what do you think of those ideas?
Well, first on the going private avenue, while I don't think it's tied principally to issues of executive compensation, I certainly have heard board members and C-suite members in private companies speak of the advantages of being private so that the terms of the transaction between the C-suite and the board remain private for the most part. And so there's no question in my mind that one of the ways to avoid some of these complexities is to have a company go private and then, in some sense, privatize the conversation about the terms of performance and terms of compensation, terms of ownership within a much smaller group rather than subjecting it to the review of the Wall Street Journal and thousands of shareholders.
Right. And what about the idea of growing your own CEO candidates?
Well, there's also pretty significant evidence, and I suspect Don can comment about this as well, that some of the best managed companies are companies that in fact grow their own, have a well-structured succession plan that reaches several levels below the CEO and continually identifies those candidates who are ready to move up in the organization and eventually become CEO. That establishes a culture of expectation in the company that I can do well here, and that has tremendously beneficial effects on the culture of the organization.
Don, what do you think?
With regard to public and private, I think we have to acknowledge that the pressures on a CEO of a publicly traded company are immense. What we saw in the late 90s was the earnings management that we've talked about earlier, and the running the numbers, the earnings call, the tremendous pressure that takes place on a CEO. Right here in Denver, Exhibit A would be Joe Naccio at Quest. He's in jail, but for a long time the numbers looked good, and profits came in, and bonuses came, and stock options paid well. So yes, I understand the need to go private, but there's a sense in which the conversation has to continue as to publicly held companies.
Mm-hmm.
And Aspen Institute, just 2 years ago, did a wonderful paper called Overcoming Short-Termism, where they suggested specific changes to the Delaware Corporate Code, or corporate codes generally, in terms of the expectations put on public companies and their earnings reports, and how executives would be compensated, and how to make long-term alignments take place rather than the kind of short-term hits that people were encouraged to do in the 90s and earlier part of the 2000s, I guess we'll call them. So there are structural changes. It's a wonderful document. People like Warren Buffett and John Bogle signed on to this document, along with Wolfenson and quite a few other leading capitalists. And I would just refer people to the Aspen Institute's principles and their about short 8-page document called Overcoming Short-Termism. I don't think we can give up on public companies entirely. And I think that we need to continue the conversation and see if we can relieve some of this pressure towards short-termism that is driving a lot of why people want to go private.
Yeah.